Hello, and my name is Pete Rushmer, and I'm your host today of A Half Dozen Things podcast. A Half Dozen Things is a podcast for business owners just like you. Whether you're an underdog hungry for success, or you're already smashing it but want to continue to level up, we are here each week for you to get insight and learning from the very best in the business. No fluff, no BS, and no self-proclaimed gurus talking about how easy business or life is. Hello and welcome to A Half Dozen Things podcast. I'm really excited today to be joined by Tom Geraghty. I should have checked that before we went online that I was pronouncing it correctly, but I've got a thumbs up to say it's working, so that's good. Tom, absolute pleasure to have you on today's podcast. I actually, for those listeners who don't know Tom or haven't come across Tom, please do add him on LinkedIn. He is an expert in psychological safety. Business is called Psychsafety.com, which he founded. And I came across you, Tom, at the National Highways Conference, which was back in March. Really cool location at the Space Centre. I absolutely loved that location, and some really amazing speakers as well, Tom, right? What did it feel like to be the warm-up act for Matthew?
Yeah, it was really cool. It was really cool, and such an amazing venue as well, and incredible. Like, what's that big dome called? The huge auditorium. There's like star dome thing inside.
It's ridiculous, isn't it?
Cool. Yeah.
It's so really cool. And so if any of you have never been to the, I think it's called the National Space Centre in Leicester. I think that's the name of it. Yeah. If you haven't been, particularly if you've got kids or even if you're just a big kid like Tom and I are, just get along. It's pretty cool. Really cool place. And National Highways Conference is always a good one. So I was there exhibiting with Flagship, and I was particularly drawn by Matthew Syed, who I reckon probably before the event, you probably had come across some of his work anyway, Tom, right? Because he starts to talk a bit about psychological safety in his book, Black Box Thinking. Awesome. And Rebel Ideas, what a great book too. Talk about cognitive diversity, which we actually will touch probably on both of those things today as part of our discussion. Tom, you were sort of talking before during that session around psychological safety. So I guess the first question is who are you, Tom? And which is quite deep, isn't it? It's quite deep. Who are you? I am awareness. Anyway, that's like my go-to. So Tom, who are you, and what sort of chain of events led to you to speak at such a prestigious stage as the National Highways and your conference?
Yeah, thanks, Pete. So who am I? Cogito ergo sum, isn't it? Descartes. I think therefore I am. That's what I am. But so my name's Tom Geraghty, and I'm the founder of a website called Psychsafety.com. My background originally, like 20 something years ago, is as an ecologist, ecological research. Then I moved into tech, and I had a fairly long career through tech. Started off as a sysadmin, started managing teams, and started to become like really interested in the conditions in which people and teams can thrive. How do we foster the right environment where teams and people can do amazing work? And I think that came from a sort of ecological background. At some point during that time, I came across the term psychological safety, and that was my like proper epiphany light bulb moment. Like, it really felt like it just changed. Everything just changed, because what I'd been trying to do for like over a decade was foster psychological safety. I just didn't know it. I just didn't have the words for it. I just sort of saw it as doing good stuff, doing things right, trying to manage people well and create the right conditions. And then here we are. There's this term. It's a real thing. It's a real thing that I was trying to do. And that at that point, I started to get really sort of, that opened loads of doors. So I started talking about it, doing conference talks and meetups and things like that. And and a few years back, we went independent and just fired up Psychsafety.com. That turned into a business, and now I'm a professional psychological safety geek, which is awesome, super fun. Yeah.
I love that, and that's so cool. So I guess that really leads to the next element, which is kind of the first of the half dozen things, which is, so Tom, you've kind of found this thing, and I'm hoping that the listeners are going to potentially have that light bulb moment that you had when you sort of came across this psychological safety terminology and this principle. So what is it? What is psychological safety, and how do we? Well, I guess first of all, what is it? If you're able to give some information, and then we'll go into the deeper stuff.
Yeah. Let's do that. So the sort of simplest definition of psychological safety is that it's a belief that the group that you're in is safe for interpersonal risk taking. That is to say, so when we talk about interpersonal risks, that is to say, it's a belief that you won't be punished or humiliated or otherwise face negative consequences for speaking up in that group with your questions, concerns, mistakes, or ideas. And of course, that speaking up might not necessarily be verbal. It might be written format or sign language or what however we prefer to communicate. It doesn't necessarily have to be via speech, but and it's worth it's worth diving into that a little bit deeper. Actually, shall I I can talk about how. So Amy Edmondson wrote a book on it, and she didn't discover it necessarily, but she was the one who sort of brought it to the forefront. So back in the 90s, Amy Edmondson was studying for her PhD at Harvard Business School. She's a professor there now, and she was studying clinical teams. She was studying high-performing clinical teams. And what she was interested in was the mistakes that teams make, and so her hypothesis was that high-performing teams would make fewer mistakes than low-performing teams, which of course sounds legit, right? That makes sense. And so in a clinical setting, there are mistakes. There are incidents called adverse medication events. This is where a patient gets given the wrong medicine or the wrong amount or at the wrong time or no medicine at all. So that's an adverse medication event, and they're recorded. So what Amy Edmondson was able to do was look at the high-performing teams. They're the teams that had the best patient outcomes, and the low-performing teams who had worse patient outcomes, where more patients died, and look at the number of adverse medication events recorded against those teams. And there was a strange result because it looked like the high-performing teams were actually making more mistakes than the low-performing teams. And of course, that didn't make sense. And Amy, if you read her book, The Fearless Organization, and her new one, The Right Kind of Wrong, she talks about how she had this sudden feeling like, oh no, my whole PhD, my whole thesis is wrong. What do I do now? But then all the interesting discoveries in science and the world come from people going, oh, that's weird, don't they? It's like, that doesn't make sense. What's going on there? And so what was actually going on there was that the people in the high-performing teams were admitting their mistakes and talking about them. And then the low-performing teams, they were hiding them.
Sure.
So we can hypothesize, we don't actually know, but we can hypothesize that the number of mistakes made in the low-performing teams were higher, but we don't actually know because they were never written down or talked about. And in the high-performing teams, because they were able to talk about them, write them down, discuss them, and admit them, and they weren't punished for doing so, they were able to learn from those mistakes and share that learning. So if someone accidentally gave the patient the wrong medicine or nearly did or something like that, then they're able to go back to the group and say, I made a mistake, this is what happened. And the whole group are able to come together and work out a way to prevent or mitigate that happening in the future. So everyone gets the benefit of that mistake. And then not only that, of course, but they're able to get in front of the mistake. So if the patient actually has got the wrong medicine, then they're able to quickly identify what they should have and fix it and make, do whatever they need to do. In the low performing team, of course, the mistakes are hidden, and so they're not able to learn from them. So different people in the same team make the same mistake over and again, and that those mistakes, the impact is much greater because it's hidden only until it's too big to hide. So when a patient dies or something else bad happens, that's when the mistake surfaces, rather than one of us in the group saying, I've made a mistake. And and I need your help. Let's fix it. So that's where that's where Amy Edmondson kind of codified this term psychological safety, which had already been mentioned in the literature back in the 50s, originally in psychiatry, but throughout the latter half of the 20th century, it never really went anywhere other than academic papers and stuff. It was when Amy Edmondson's research codified it that brought it into the world of work and the bigger world. Yeah.
And that's fascinating because, we, particularly in the industry that a lot of my listeners will come from a fleet and transport sort of background, there'll be lots of mistakes that occur, and then there'll be an element of investigation, and then there'll be an element of blame, and then we talk about blame and those kinds of stuff, which I guess blame is bad for interpersonal risk taking, right?
Pretty bad. Yeah,
pretty bad, right? So I've just a real quick one, I guess, because the other challenge we've got is that it's largely a male dominated environment. So maybe like boiler room mentality, that kind of stuff. I'm not talking Wolf of Wall Street, but at the same time, I'm talking, like high standards of piss taking.
Yeah.
So I guess, and that high standards of piss taking is probably bad for psychological safety as well, right? Because it's bad for risk taking. So I guess there's just a bit of a question in there around, I think we can have the piss taken, but we can have it. It's a subtle thing about still being able to create a environment which is okay for people to feel like they can take risks.
Yeah, well, take into personal risks, and I think this is the really interesting point, because, and you're absolutely right. You see the same sort of dynamics in construction,
sure,
and other sort of male-dominated industries, where there is this sort of like a banter culture, and piss taking and stuff like that, and we work with all sorts of firms in all sorts of industries, from aviation to healthcare to education, tech, and all sorts of stuff. And that's kind of what keeps it interesting. And we touch on quite a lot of quite safety critical industries, such as construction or farming or power generation. And in some of these, particularly in construction, we come across stories and cases where people have wanted, like there was one particular case where there's a lad who wasn't wearing his safety gear, he wasn't wearing a safety helmet, and he was just turning up in like Converse instead of steel toe-cap boots and things like that. And eventually it turned out that he was scared of being ridiculed for wearing the safety gear, because there was this culture on site of sort of bravado, this sort of safety bravado, where you didn't need to wear safety specs, you just did the safety squint, and which doesn't actually work. And there's this bravado, there's a sort of psychological safety. Psychological safety doesn't look the same in all contexts, and piss taking and a bit of banter can be a good thing. It can be a good way of bonding, and feeling like you're part of a group. And it can make work enjoyable. Work should be enjoyable, right? That's all right. That's okay. But when it veers into that side of making people feel uncomfortable in doing the right thing, or making ethical choices, or making safe choices, then that's where it gets dangerous. That's where we see a lot of danger, and unsafe behaviors occurring, because people feel psychologically unsafe to say, no, actually, I want to wear a helmet because there's heavy bricks and stuff falling around, so I'm going to wear one.
And I guess this sort of falls into the fifth area around the complexity and that sort of stuff. So I'm gonna pause that now. That was a bit of a curve question, but I have like this thing where sometimes my mouth just opens and stuff comes out, right? So the second thing, I think we've framed what psych safety is. So am I okay calling it Psychsafety, by the way? Because that's the name of your business as well, right?
Yeah.
Safety is good. Is that okay?
Yeah, I tend to call it Psychsafety quite a lot, just because it's a mouthful, isn't it?
It's a lot of syllables, isn't it? It's a lot of syllables.
Yeah, it is.
Cool. Okay, good. So the second thing we were going to talk about was the history, which you've touched on with Amy Edmondson. So the next, I guess the question is what's the history? But I haven't actually asked, or you didn't answer, what brought you to be speaking at the National Highways? How did that come about? So let's do the National Highway. Whilst we're talking about history, how did you come to speak at the National Highways? And then tell me about the history, or any more history other than Amy.
Yeah, so the National Highways event was a bit out of the blue, actually, and it was quite short notice, actually. So I have a bit of a history of this, where a speaker is booked and then they pull out or cancel or can't turn up or something, and then someone contacts me and says, "Oh, we really want you to speak at this thing, but it's next week."
And you're even better than the person we had booked.
I hope so. But yeah, exactly. And so that's how it worked with the Highways Agency. In fact, that's also what happened with my first ever large conference talk on psychological safety, the one that kind of catalyzed all of this blowing up, because and that was back in about 2017 or 18 or something. But yeah, and I think it's interesting that psychological safety in it. I guess we're going to get into the history of it, sort of thing. But it's really taken off. It's really catalyzed. It's really become a much better known term over the past 6 or 7 years, and certainly over the past 2 or 3 years, such that, I think if you look at some people who drive for a living or national highways, folks, they wouldn't have heard of psychological safety 2 or 3 years ago.
Sure.
And when I first spoke about it in 2017, no one had heard of it. It was a brand new, strange concept.
Yeah.
But now most people have heard of it.
Sure.
At least in some sense. And I think that's where, and we're going to get into this soon, I think, but there are a lot of misconceptions and things appearing and sort of surfacing because of that. Yeah.
Okay. So from a history perspective, 6 to 7 years is sort of since it first sort of came about. Last 2 to 3 years, we've probably seen this sort of steep upward curve. And I'm guessing that's then created myths, which is the next section around it. But before we go on to myths, and so Amy Edmondson, kind of her initial piece sort of really brought it to light with her research, groundbreaking research. Talk me a bit more through the sort of last 6 to 7 years and how the concepts developed.
Yeah. So what's kind of interesting is, and I'm just trying to reach up my shelf here because there's a couple of books here. So Amy's research was published in 1999, and for quite a while it just sat in the sort of academic world, and there was a lot of research, much led by Amy, but lots of other teams, lots of other folks got involved in research, but it sat firmly, it stayed in that academic world, in that academic bubble. And then in 2013, Google ran a project called Project Aristotle, led by a woman called Julia Rozovsky, and they again were studying high performing teams. They realized, they'd noted that there were lots of different teams in Google. Some were much more higher performing than others, and so they were trying to work out why are some teams much higher performing than other teams. What are the elements? What are the ingredients? What are the factors that go into high performing teams? And so they ran this research project Aristotle, and they found various factors were important, like meaning, structuring, clarity, dependability, things like that were sort of the core foundations, like the core capabilities of high performing teams. People need to give a damn about what they do for a living day to day. They need to be able to rely on each other. They need to be able to. They need to understand their priorities and goals and things like that. But these factors weren't enough by themselves. Teams that scored high on these things still showed big differences between them. So the Project Aristotle team knew that there was at least one thing missing, and they presumably Googled for high-performing teams, and they found Amy Edmondson's paper from 1999, and they measured psychological safety according to her methodologies back from her studies, and they found psychological safety was high amongst every single high-performing team in Google that they measured. and low in all the low performing teams. It mapped directly onto performance. It was directly relative to performance. That is to say, you could be great at all this structure and clarity and meaning and dependability and all that sort of stuff, but a team was never going to reach its potential unless the people in that team felt psychologically safe. And so that was a great piece of industry research that took it out of academia and into the industrial world.
Sure.
But what really sort of showed that to the world was the New York Times piece about Google Project Aristotle. That I can't remember the title now, but it's something like Google studied their teams and they found this thing was the most important thing, and it's like this whole paradigm shift. That was what suddenly catalyzed that was what brought it into the to the world of work, to the practitioner world, where we do the work. And that was sort of 2013, 2014, and then in, I think it was 2016, I might have this wrong, Amy published the Phyllis organization, sort of based upon all this interest, all this hype, and this interest that had gone on about psychological safety. So the Phyllis organization was kind of the book that brought it to the masses, to the rest of the world.
Isn't that mad though, right? 99 she first started talking about
this. Yeah.
And then we're talking like 2018 it really starting, or sorry, 2016, 17 it's starting to really hit mainstream. That's incredible, isn't it?
Yeah, and I think this is where, I mean, we could, like, this is definitely a rabbit hole or an avenue, but this is where I do think there is, in many fields, in many domains, there is a gap between academia and practice, and it can be quite hard for ideas in academia to spread, to sort of diffuse into the world of practice and into the real world, if you like.
Sure.
And because those pathways don't always exist, and it takes something like a big newspaper article or a book to get that traction.
Yeah, society's just not ready for it yet.
Yeah, well, and most of us don't have access to academic papers, and generally don't sit at home or at work reading academic papers, or know which ones to read, or even have access to them, because a lot of them are behind closed off journal paywalls and things, which is a rant for another time for me.
Cool. Okay, cool. So the next area then, now that we've done a brief history of time to, according to Psychsafety anyway, the third area is around myths. So what are some of the myths of Psychsafety?
Yeah, so this is an important one, because with any idea that gets quite popular, people sort of hear the term and immediately sort of impose their own translation into it, which is fair, and that can persist, and it sort of gets distorted, and so there are quite a lot of myths around psychological safety, or at least misconceptions or misinterpretations of it. The first one is that it's all about wellness and well-being and well-being at work, and being and wrapping people in cotton wool, and not having any conflict. And that's absolutely not true. It's not just a wellness and well-being thing. It does affect wellness and well-being for sure, because if we don't feel psychologically safe, we're very unlikely to be able to put our hand up and say, I'm burning out, or I'm struggling, or I'm sick, or I'm going through some stuff at home, I'm going through a divorce, and I need to take my foot off the gas for a bit, or whatever it is, whatever we're going through, we need to feel psychologically safe to be open and transparent with our workmates and colleagues and bosses, to say, I need some help, or just ask for what we need. And if we can't do that, then that's where we start to risk burnout.
Yeah, sure.
So it's definitely related to well-being and wellness at work, but it's not like, that's not what it is, and it's definitely not avoiding conflict. Psychological safety actually means potentially more conflict, and respectful conflict, where we can address the things that we disagree on, or we've got different experiences of, without people sort of getting. I know we might get emotional about it, but and that's okay, because we can feel strongly about things. But but it doesn't cause lasting harm, and it's done in a respectful way. And that's difficult. It's particularly difficult, in fact, for managers and leaders, because a lot of managers and leaders are used to this, sort of have learned and are used to this world where they don't get challenged. If they say, if they tell someone to go and do a job, they'll just go and do the job, whether even if it's not the sensible thing to do, or they've told them the wrong thing, or they haven't understood the priorities right. They'll just do what their boss tells them to do, because that's, otherwise you get in trouble, right? Or and bosses don't, it's where bosses or managers don't hear the bad news. They don't hear the bad news, like the project is running late, or there's a problem with this task, and it's just hushed as much as possible, because no one wants to give the boss bad news. But in fact, in psychologically safe workspaces, we do give the boss bad news. And it exists, so we should hear it, right? We want to hear it straight away. But it also means people challenging the boss's ideas, or the way we do things around here, and challenging even the way, the strategy, or challenging the big stuff, and saying out loud, I don't agree with that, or I think I've got a better way. And that can be really uncomfortable for a lot of folks who are used to sort of the old
being in charge, right?
Yeah, they're used to the sort of power, and people not challenging them, and that can be really uncomfortable. And then there's there's a load of other myths, like I heard one, someone said silence is bad. There was a perception that silence is always bad, and if you ask a question in a group and no one speaks up or suggests anything, or then it's a bad thing. And that's not necessarily true either. Certain types of silence might be bad, but silence can just be you're trying to think of the right answer, or you're trying to work it out, or you're trying to think of the best way to articulate the thing you're trying to say, because it's quite complex. And when you're like with your best friends or with your partner, you can sit in silence and you don't feel like weird about it. It's just you're just there. And in the best teams where you feel comfortable with each other, silence is okay. You're thinking, you're having you just need a bit of time, or you're getting to it. So psychological safety doesn't mean employees all the time. It doesn't mean everyone's talking all the time, and it can mean silence, which I know is weird, but it all depends on the dynamics of the team. And sometimes it can be one of the practices actually to foster greater psychological safety is it can be encouraging a bit of silence when you ask a question or ask for some suggestions. Say, you ask a question and say, right, no one talk for 30 seconds or a minute, make some notes, write some things down, and then we'll get some ideas from around the room. Because the other thing is that we don't want the only voices that we hear to be the loud voices, the people who are like, I just want to talk, I just want to hear my own voice.
Hi, it's Pete from Flagship Partners. We're proud to sponsor a Half Dozen Things podcast. Flagship Partners help their clients become safer, greener, and greater through a range of consultancy and training services. We offer audits through to risk assessments, contracts through to support with managing your culture, all the way from mandatory training through to management training as well. So if you need any support, please do get in touch with Flagship Partners today.
And that therein lies a challenge, because you've got different personality types, haven't you, who do different stuff. I guess one of the myths is where my head sort of went with it, was that it's some leaders might be scared that it's disempowering, because there's this level of groupthink or rebel ideas, I suppose, that's around psych safety. And when someone's been used to calling the shots, making the decisions, being in charge, because we've historically associated leaders with being in charge, and actually, I guess it's fundamentally research proven that the best leaders aren't the ones who are in charge; they're just the ones who facilitate the best thinking and finding the best outcomes. It's interesting, isn't it? Really, really interesting how that role shifts. I guess that sort of comes into the implementation bit, which we'll talk about in 6. But all of this is quite, I don't know. I guess my question, I think one of my questions, because there wasn't a question there, I think it was just something I've noticed. But one of my questions is Psychsafety cultural? Is it a culture?
So depends what we mean by culture. Culture is a tricky word, right? Culture.
It is very open to interpretation.
Yeah.
When I say culture, I think I'm going to pull on something you said before. So in my map of the world, have you done NLP, by the way?
No, but I'm well aware of it, and I understand NLP. Yeah.
Cool. So in NLP, we've got this term. So I've done master practitioner and master practitioner, and highly recommend it, by the way, Tom. I think you'd really enjoy it. But in NLP, we talk about our map of the world, which is essentially this principle that every individual over the period of their life gets programmed around the things they believe, the filters that they filter the world through, and stuff like that. That then creates essentially this person's map of the world. So when you talk about culture, for example, what culture means to me and what it means to you, Tom, two different things, because we've had a whole life experience of different workplaces, different environments, different leaders, different managers. In my map of the world, and I guess this is creating some psychological safety around the fact that I'm just recognizing that our maps are different, because they will be. But in my map of the world, culture is around the way things are done around here, which is a term you used earlier.
Yeah.
So I perceive culture to be almost an unspoken set of rules. Often they might be spoken or unspoken, but it's kind of in my head. It's so in my head, and that's why I guess I'm asking if it's a myth. It's so closely linked to psychological safety because it's that thing of. See, I'm going back to that definition that you said about that interpersonal risk taking. Do I feel safe to ask this question? Or I'm going to just do this because it's not worth the hassle of me not doing it, even though it's a mindless task and actually it'd be much better done another way. But this is the way we've always done it, so I'm going to carry on doing it. That's kind of that is culture, you know. I talked earlier about boiler room culture, right? So you've got like this highly masculine, toxic masculine culture where basically guys won't wear their PPE because they're fear, you know, even though they feel unsafe, right? Even though they actually want to wear it, they won't wear it because the herd mentality is stronger than the individuals. You know, so culture isn't always bad or good, and it's sometimes good and bad, because that's the other thing. We talk about a bad and a good culture, and actually a culture isn't good inherently good or bad. It's just the culture, and I think that's sometimes an issue as well. Sorry, I'm going down a rabbit hole here.
No, that's good.
Like sometimes culture isn't good or bad, or it can create really good behaviors, but also create bad behaviors at the same time, right? A bit like the piss taking. Really good in one sense for camaraderie and team spirit and bonding and all of those sorts of things. Sometimes maybe bad for safety, potentially. You know, so it's not all good and all bad either. Sorry, my mind, I've baffled my own mind. I don't really know where I went there.
No, but you're spot on. You're absolutely spot on. And so I think it's important to differentiate between sort of organizational culture and what we might call sort of national culture. Like, let's say British culture or German culture or Japanese. Because that has an influence as well, right? But organizational culture is so the way we actually try to avoid the word culture because it's so ambiguous. But it is, culture is what we do and how we do it. Right? It's how we communicate. It's how we communicate with each other. It's the behaviors that we do at work. It's what we do and how we do it. It's the practices that we use. It's what practices we value. It's the things that we value. It's our goals. It's our history. You know, it's all the baggage and stories that we have as well behind what's happened in the past and things like that. We've done some work with the post office recently with some of their tech teams, and you know, there's obviously some history and baggage there that affects current culture and how they're trying to sort of heal from that and move on. And so you've got the same in many organizations like NASA. So NASA is a great example because there's a great book on this called the Challenger Launch Decision, which is just a really big book. Diane Vaughan, and she talks about how the Challenger disaster sort of unrolled. And you were mentioned earlier about how someone might do a task or do something a certain way because that's just how we do it here. That's just how we've always done it. It's not the right way. It's not the best way. It might not even be the safe way, but it's how we always do it. Diane calls that normalization of deviance. Deviance with a CE, not deviance with a TS. And she just, this is the deviance from the good. And it might be the deviance from policy or procedure. It might just be deviance from safe practice or the good practice. And that's often steered by culture, so these stories and histories and things like that. It's also groupthink. You're sort of talking about how there's this peer pressure to act in a certain way. That's sort of groupthink. If Bob and Barry and Dave all do it that way, then then I should do it that way, even though I'm pretty sure this isn't the right way. I'm going to do it the way they do it because that's what I see everyone else doing. And so this is where sort of the world of safety really sort of intertwines with psychological safety, because we have to feel safe. We have to feel psychologically safe to take those interpersonal risks and say, how are you doing that? Is that the right way of doing it? Is that safe? Could we try it this way? Could we do this? Do we have to do that at all? Why do we push that button? It doesn't do anything. And or all of those things. And so we can improve safety at the sharp end of work, whether it's driving or on a building site or whatever it is we're doing. We can improve safety at the sharp end by helping people feel psychologically safe to say, is this the right way of doing things? Or I've got a suggestion for improvement.
Sure.
Or someone else saying, oh, you're doing that. That's not right. You're doing that wrong. That's unsafe. Rather than feeling like if they point that out to their mate, they're going to get ripped out. Because that's a fear. That's a big fear.
Yeah, sure. I wanted to pick up. I kind of smiled at when you mentioned the post office and you were talking about the post office and Psychsafety, and I didn't mean to smile in that way. It was just that I was so obviously aware of the challenges they've had from a tech perspective that it was a reaction it caused in my head. So apologies, and hopefully you didn't take offence by that, because there's obviously been some horrific outcomes from those situations, which well, if only they'd discovered Psychsafety sooner, then potentially there was some unavoidable catastrophes that occurred that had some really devastating human impact. So I just wanted to sort of recognize that. Anyway, so the fourth area was around how Psychsafety presents issues or examples in a workplace context. So what do people listening, what would they be looking out for in their organization to see whether they had Psychsafety or didn't have Psychsafety? Or have you got a really good example? I know you spoke before about the Tenerife incident.
So first of all, so the things you might hear or see written down, the things you might hear are things like, are people saying things like, I don't know, or I made a mistake, or I need some help, or I have an idea, or I disagree, or I made a really big mistake, or Bob made a mistake, or challenging. Those sorts of things are the things we hear when we have greater psychological safety. We can always improve. We can always do more. What's really powerful about those things, hearing those things like I made a mistake, I have an idea, I disagree, especially stuff like I made a mistake, because that's opening up quite a degree of vulnerability, is that yes, they're indicators of psychological safety, but they're also mediators. They're also ways to increase it, because if we, either as peers or managers or colleagues or in fact even family and friends, the more we say those things and do those things and admit our mistakes and ask for help, the more we're making it safe for other people around us to do the same. And that particularly often applies if we're in some sort of position of power. When I say power, like it might be that you're in a management or leadership or supervisory position, but it might not. It might just be that you've been with that company like 2 decades, and so you're well respected. You're not like senior in that sense, but you're well respected. You've got a lot of experience, and people respect what you have to say. And so if you say, "Oh yeah, I made a really big mistake," or even if if you want to talk about mistakes that you made 10 years ago and that you've learned from, and you're still around, that can be really encouraging, particularly for people new to the organization, or new to the career, new to the workplace. Because particularly early in your career, I know, my belief was that if I made a mistake or admitted it to my boss, that's it. Like, career over, done. You don't realize that most of us in our careers have made some really big fuck-ups, and we're like really big ones, and we're still around to tell the tale, and we learn from it, and having those conversations is really powerful. Yeah, and like you say, like there's a lot of, we talked about disasters a moment ago with the post office and things like that. There's a number of disasters that have occurred. In fact, I would potentially argue that almost any big disaster that could be called a disaster has somewhere in its causal factors a lack of psychological safety. Some stage where it could have been prevented or at least mitigated if someone somewhere had felt safe to say, "I think we have a problem," or "I have a concern," or "I've got a suggestion for doing that differently," or "Stop," or something like that. And the Tenerife disaster is a great example of that, where
just for those that won't be aware, can you just sort of give a quick summary of what happened in the Tenerife disaster? It sounds a bit like what Matthew Syed wrote about in Black Box Thinking, with the woman at the operating table, and the nurse didn't feel safe to speak up to the doctor. She is picking up all the signs that there's an issue, and because of the hierarchy in that operating theatre, she didn't feel safe to speak up.
Yeah, it's exactly that. And for anyone listening, that's the story of Elaine Bromley, who died on the operating theatre when they were trying to intubate her, but there were a number of failed attempts, and the nurses could see that this was going wrong, and yet didn't challenge the doctors in that room at the time because of this power gradient, this sort of differential in power. And Martin Bromley, who definitely was, maybe still is, an airline pilot, has now formed the Human Factors Research Group, I think it's called, and campaigns for these sorts of, for essentially psychological safety and human factors practice to prevent the same sorts of disasters happening again. And you can see exactly the same dynamics in the Tenerife disaster of 1977, which is the most deadly aviation disaster in human history. It happened on the ground, on the runway. And there's a load of other factors that will go that we could get it. Like, we could do a whole podcast about this, or a series. But loads of planes were diverted from Gran Canaria Airport because there was a bomb scare. And so they had to get diverted to Tenerife, which is a much smaller airport with only one runway. So all these planes have to land on this airport, and they're all parked up on the slipways and the apron. There's not much room left. So when they get the clearance to take off again, they have to taxi along the runway, turn around at the other end, and take off back the way they taxied along. There's a KLM flight captained by Captain Jacob Van Zanten, and they taxi along. They turn around at the end, and the captain starts to throttle the engines to go. Now, at that point, Klaus Muers, the first officer, speaks up and says, "We don't have ATC clearance, air traffic control clearance." And the captain just says, "Get it." Well, he says it in Dutch, but it says "get it." And then he carries on rolling along the runway and speeding up. Flight engineer William Schroeder then spoke up and said, "That Pan Am, is he clear?" Because William Schroeder was aware that there was a Pan Am 747 taxiing along behind them that was supposed to have turned off onto the slipway, but they hadn't had confirmation from ATC that had actually happened. The captain then, in response to this question, just says, "Oh, yes." And it's not clear whether Captain Van Zanten meant, "Oh, yes," like, "Yes, he's clear," or "Yes, we should check." But in any case, he carried on speeding up along the runway. And at that point, from that point, neither Klaus Muers nor William Schroeder, the other two flight crew, spoke up and said a word, even though they both had concerns. They both had concerns that A, they were taking off without clearance, and B, there was potentially another plane on the runway. So their own lives were at risk, and hundreds of lives of their passengers and the passengers of the other plane, and yet they still didn't speak up. And that's how strong a lack of psychological safety can be. You know, we can say to people, speak up if you see something unsafe. Speak up if you make a mistake. Speak up if you have a concern or an idea. But if people, in certain circumstances, particularly against a power gradient, because there was this, Captain Van Zanten in this cockpit was quite a senior, well-respected kind of guy, particularly up against a power gradient, it can be very difficult, very fearful for people to speak up. And so even when their own lives are at risk, even when there are other hundreds of lives at risk, people still might not speak up. So, you know, if we're in what we perceive to be a much more minor thing in the workplace, it's hardly surprising that people don't speak up with, or challenge Bob for using a screwdriver in the wrong way or something. You know, it's that's how powerful a lack of psychological safety can be.
Yeah, sure. And you know, even in its worst case, it could lead to things as horrific as the Holocaust and those kinds of things as well, right?
Yeah.
Because in its most severe sense, you end up creating people who will do things, you know, essentially. It's a horrible example, to be fair, and as a descendant of Jewish heritage myself, you know, it's a horrific example, but it does help to explain there was not, you know, the Nazis were not, they weren't just born a load of serial killing machines in a certain place. That was created through a culture change, through programming, through leadership, through the inability for people to get off the bus because they just couldn't challenge.
You only need to look at you need to look at people like like Putin's Russia, his cabinet and places like that, where people, I don't think I'm being too controversial if I say I suspect people in Putin's cabinet do not feel safe in speaking up and challenging something.
100%. Well, look at what his nearest challenger has happened. Like the nearest challenger, I don't really follow it closely, right? But I'm sure he went to prison and has since died, right?
Yeah. So like that's the extreme end of psychological safety, where it's even not even psychological safety anymore. It's actual physical, like life and death safety. If I say this thing, I might get killed. But it's the same dynamic, you know. And that's why it's partly why really terrible things can happen, from the Tenerife disaster to Chernobyl to the Nagasaki train crash to the global financial crisis. You know, there must have been people sitting in those boardrooms selling subprime mortgages thinking, I've got a bad feeling about this. This
ain't right.
Yeah. But I don't want to be the party pooper. I don't want to spoil everyone's fun. So I'm going to keep quiet.
Yeah. No, exactly. But that's part of the challenge of human nature, which is the being shunned from the tribe is literally life and death for people, right? And we're still working on that set of software. Fascinating, absolutely fascinating. So we've still got 2 areas to go, so I'm conscious of time, right? So the next one is, so we've got 2 things next, which is complexity. So if people hadn't already picked up, this is complex, but it's even more complex which I'm sure you're going to talk about in a mo, where different people have different needs and different expectations. And then the final one is just for listeners, how they could help implement what are the skills they need and the things they need to do. So they're sort of the two final areas, Tom. So let's go with complexity. What about, so tell me about, why is it so complex then? Why is it so complex?
So it's tricky. And this is one of the criticisms I have of the psychological safety field, the broader field of psychological safety, if you like. It's generally framed as quite westernized, quite businessy, often a bit Americanized, certainly quite neurotypical and sort of white and English speaking. That's how it's often framed in that context. And it's really like it's much more complicated than that. What looks or appears psychologically safe to one group will not feel psychologically safe to another group. And if we take the building site and a sort of group of men on a building site as one example, they feel psychologically safe having a bit of banter, taking the piss out of each other, and that's how they like to prefer. That's how they prefer to communicate. That is psychologically safe to them. And the way they might raise a concern or something might not look like the way that someone else would do it, but it's good. It works. It's psychologically safe. In a different team, let's say a group of software engineers, in an office, they're sitting there in the subdued lighting. They've got the headphones on. They've got 3 screens around them, and they wouldn't look psychologically safe to those chaps on a building site, but they are. They're having. They're probably having 10 conversations at once on Slack and Teams and things, and they feel safe. It's just a different style of working.
Sure.
Then you've got things like, so we talked about national cultures earlier. So we've got cultural differences in the West. If someone in authority is speaking in a meeting, we tend to look at them. We tend to look at them and listen to them and look at their eye and get eye contact. In certain cultures in Japan, for example, if that same person in authority was speaking, the other people in the room would be looking down at the table, not maintaining eye contact as a sign of respect. And that in itself, like if you transpose that into different settings, if the person who wasn't aware of that culture might think, why is no one paying attention to me? What's going on here? It doesn't mean anything's wrong. It's like it's not good or bad. It's just different. Then you've got things like neurodiversities where we might have we might prefer not to speak up verbally. We might prefer to use written language and make notes and communicate via written format, or we might be deaf and use sign language, or we might have a tic or stutter. I used to have a stutter. In fact, I used to have speech therapy. I had a stutter and stammer, and I know what it's like to feel afraid or have that anxiety about speaking up because you're worried about how it will come out. And then we've got a load of other sort of intersectional and other aspects to deal with. So it's complex because we can't just there's no one single blueprint for psychological safety and what it looks like in a group, because every person is different, every group is different.
Sure.
So we need to try and create the conditions in which people feel safe and able to speak up and communicate in the way that suits them, but also suits the rest of the people in the group. Because also we've got things like simple language. If I'm in a meeting with 10 Spanish people and the meeting is in Spanish, I'm probably not going to feel very able to speak up because I can just about order a beer. So,
you can do more than me then, Tom.
I've got the important stuff down. And so it's just basic stuff like that. Like if we're having a meeting in someone else's, if one of the members of the group is if that's their second language, they're not going to feel as able, as ready, as confident in speaking up to the group.
For sure.
They just don't have the language. So we need to be conscious of all that stuff, and it's really it's complex. It's tricky.
Sure. So okay, so the final question then is what can we do? What can we do now that we know this stuff? So leaders, managers who are listening, what can they do? What does great look like in the best organizations?
Really good question. And there's loads you can do. There's so much you can do. But probably the first and like the easiest thing is to talk about psychological safety in a kind of like weird meta ironic way. Make psychological safety a safe thing to talk about. It's okay to talk about psychological safety. It's okay to talk about how we can foster greater psychological safety in this group, in this company, between these two teams, in this setting. That's a good and okay thing to talk about. And so make it safe to talk about. Make it a common piece of a topic of conversation. Second of all, model those psychologically safe behaviors. Things like, we talked about this earlier, like admitting a mistake, talking about our mistakes, creating space and opportunity for talking about mistakes and concerns and ideas in a way that actually facilitates a good and productive meeting, whatever we want to call it. Like, so it's not just a quick 15 minutes. Quick, who's got an idea? It's like we've got some time, we've got some space. We're going to do this properly, and maybe even with different facilitators and things like that. Another thing is addressing this power gradient. So we talked about the surgeons and the operating theatre with Elaine Bromley. We talked about Tenerife. In a lot of these cases where something has gone seriously wrong, there's a power gradient. It might not be immediately obvious to you or to other people in the group, because it might be you that's in power, but you don't perceive that. It might be you that's in power through your gender, maybe, or your status, your experience, your length of time at the company, or something else. And so trying to flatten that gradient, like at very first, acknowledge that it exists and it's a real thing, and then trying to flatten it. And there are various ways to do that. And another thing to do is to make everything. So we like to make everything an experiment. We like to call everything an experiment, because everything we do, we can learn from. Whether it turned out well or whether it turned out badly, we can learn from it and do it better, even better next time. Sure. And that's a really nice, solid foundation for fostering greater psychological safety. Because if we change the framing of things to yes, we want to succeed, we want to do really well, we want everything to be safe and fantastic, and we want to do the best job we can, but also we're going to learn from it and do it even better next time. That's, it's accepting that human error is going to happen. We're all going to make mistakes, but we can learn from them. And that's the important thing. That's the really important thing. We can always do better next time. And we can always share that information, that learning with each other. So, yeah. And there's loads more stuff. Like there's loads of different activities and practices and things we can do that work with different teams, but there's a lot of things.
Tom, I think I gave you a really hard task there, because I gave you about 5 minutes to talk about the complexity and then what to do as well. So I could see your frustration, like, oh, how's the time all gone? So I apologise of all for mismanaging the time. We spent a lot of time earlier on, and I'd maybe give you less time. But I think the fundamental purpose, I think if we go back to the fundamental purpose of this session with you and I, was this was the first time that we've introduced psychological safety to the audience for this podcast. I really hope that at least some people have had like a bit of a eureka moment and gone, wow, this is really interesting. Actually, I can really get an edge with this stuff. We can start to push things forward. It's a really good development opportunity in our organization. We could start to reduce the impact on some of the incidents that are occurring and things like that. And if you have, I guess there's, we're not going to fit all the information into it. All of Tom's bookshelf in his background, right? We're not going to fit that into an hour's podcast. So, Tom, what if people are listening and they want to reach out, get in touch, and sort of get a better understanding? What's the best way of doing that?
Yeah, good question. So head over to psychsafety.com. So just psychsafety.com or .co.uk. And over there there's loads of free stuff. So there's loads of free articles, free resources, downloadable stuff. There's a free online community you can join. There are free meetups where people sort of come and sort of share different things and different learnings. There's a newsletter and various other things. And the things you can buy as well, downloadable resources and stuff. There's also online workshops that you can join. So we run a sort of series of online workshops through the year that you can sign up to and get stuck into some of the meatier sort of practice. How do we do this sort of stuff? And we also do training for corporates and organizations and stuff all over the world. So there's tons of stuff there. Head over there and you can get in touch, or just drop an email to tom@psychsafety.com.
Awesome. Tom, you've been a fantastic guest, mate. Thank you very much for coming on and taking the time out on this Friday afternoon to do that. Listeners, I hope you really enjoyed it. If you have, do just drop us a line, connect with Tom on LinkedIn, get involved with his community. I think it sounds fantastic, and I'm certainly about to go and get involved too. And thanks very much for joining, Tom. And listeners, take care, guys. I hope you've enjoyed today's podcast, and I'll see you again on the next one. Thank you very much.
Brilliant. Thanks so much, Pete.
Cheers, Tom. I really hope you loved today's episode, and if you did, please make sure you subscribe and listen out for future episodes too.
Please do share it across your social media channels. We hope to reach more and help more people. If you want to find out more about me, my name's Pete Rushmer. You'll find me across any social media channel and my business, Flagship Partners, and we're your partners in success across your business. Thank you. See you again soon.